clause carried. All right, now we go on to clause 8, and we have an amendment here from the NDP, and I have a note here from the legislative clerk. It says, if adopted, the NDP 25 is also adopted as a consequential impact, if that NDP 2 is carried. So would you like to introduce it, Mr. Davies?
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Yes, so Section 8 of the bill is the bill that sets out a limit of Canadians possessing no more than 30 grams of dried cannabis in public. And the purpose of my amendment would be to delete that so that there is not a limit of 30 grams possession, distinguishing a Canadian who's not a criminal from one who is a criminal. The rationale for this, again, comes largely from the evidence and I think from logic as well. It's completely arbitrary to restrict possession to 30 grams. So this legislation would say that someone in public who has 29 grams of cannabis is a law-abiding citizen, and someone who's got 31 grams of cannabis is a criminal, who is subject to a jail sentence of up to 5 years. There's no clear policy goal satisfied by that distinction. I don't think anybody in this room, frankly anybody in the country, could make a compelling argument that someone with 31 grams of cannabis in public is doing anything inherently more criminal than someone with 29 grams. This measure, even worse, will continue to impose all of the harms of criminalization that the purposes of this bill that the Liberal government just passed claims to ameliorate or to enforce. We know that taking up police resources, we know that clogging up our courts, we know that criminalizing Canadians for simply possessing cannabis in amounts that are clearly for personal use or for use among their friends serves no valid purpose and in fact does a great deal of harm. It costs our society billions of dollars. It makes our court time valuable so that more serious crimes get shifted into the future. In some cases, people facing serious crimes don't even have a trial at all because of the Jordan principle, because our courts are clogged up with minor, petty cannabis offenses. We don't treat alcohol or tobacco this way. We don't criminalize adult possession of amounts of alcohol because that is inconsistent with the concept of a legalized market. Anyone in this room could back a van up to a liquor store and fill the van up with cases of scotch. Cases and cases and cases of scotch. In fact, you could fill up a semi-trailer with cases of scotch and drive away, and that's not an offense in this country. And we heard evidence, it's clear, that alcohol and tobacco are clearly more dangerous to health than cannabis is. Nobody even disputes that anymore who looks at the evidence. Yet this legislation says that if you have 31 grams of cannabis in public, you're a criminal. It makes no sense. Now I want to just talk briefly about a theme because I think it's important for Canadians. This may be a distinction without a difference. But Mr. Trudeau and the Liberals campaigned last election on legalizing cannabis. This bill has more sections of criminalization of cannabis than exist in the current criminal code. It does not legalize cannabis. It makes it less illegal. So it is still a criminal offense punishable by jail to have 31 grams or more in your possession. That's not legalization. We could argue it's better than the status quo, and I would probably agree with that, but it's not legalization. Now, there is no argument that we heard in 5 days of hearing and some 90 witnesses that cogently explained why 30 grams exists, why that number was chosen, and why anybody with more than that or less than that is a criminal or not. Neil Boyd testified that the idea that we would pass legislation that would retain a criminal offense of possession of cannabis seems to me to be inconsistent with at least part of the logic of this act. I know that the Prime Minister has repeatedly said it's about eliminating the black market and reducing access, but part of it is also about recognizing that people who have used cannabis or use cannabis do not deserve the label of criminal. Kirk Tusaw said, Bill C-45 contemplates criminal penalties being applied to adult Canadians who possess more than 30 grams of cannabis or grow more than 400 centimeter plants per household. These are completely arbitrary numbers. These criminal restrictions are decidedly unlike the way our country regulates alcohol, a vastly and inarguably more dangerous substance than cannabis. At this moment in Canada, a 19-year-old can walk into a liquor store and purchase enough alcohol to kill that person and all that person's friends and acquaintances. Indeed, there's enough alcohol in one bottle of vodka to kill the consumer. And we don't tell that person that they can't have 40 bottles of it. Paul Renault, the Communications Director of Educators for Sensible Drug Policy, said, youth cannot be criminalized for alcohol possession. What sense does it make to criminalize anybody for cannabis? So, Mr. Chair, I'll conclude just by saying, if truly we believe that the Minister of Justice and the Minister of Health, that prohibition doesn't work, then why are we persisting with provisions in the bill that continue to prohibit based on an arbitrary number that serves absolutely no logical purpose whatsoever, other than just to say Canadians can have 30 grams or under, but not more, for no logical, compelling science-based reason. I'm going to conclude by saying I've heard this government talk repeatedly, and I congratulate them for taking, claiming to take and taking in some cases an evidence-based approach to legislation. This is not an evidence-based approach to legislation. This is an arbitrary approach to legislation with no basis in science or fact. So I'm going to ask my colleagues to support the removal of the limit of 30 grams of dried cannabis and start treating adults in this country like adults. They can, certainly adults can determine how much cannabis they want to have in their possession, and there's other sections in this act that control trafficking and sale and production and distribution that will completely take care of any issue around those concepts. And let's let Canadians start having the mature decision to be able to decide how much cannabis they want to have. My final point is this. In terms of medicinal cannabis or people that are using cannabis for other reasons, someone may decide to go on a 2-month trip or a 1-month trip across Canada. And when we get to the cultivation parts, we'll see that Canadians can grow their own. Ironically, you can have 4 plants. You might be in possession of 160 grams of cannabis in your house. That's okay. But you can't have more than 30 grams in public. Well, what if someone wants to go on a trip and take 50 grams of cannabis with them for a month-long trip across Canada? They're criminals? What if someone's moving? So you move apartments and you take down your plants, you harvest your plants, you've got 100 grams. You can't, what do? You make 3 trips? I mean, this is an absurd limit. It's arbitrary and absurd. And the harm and the amount of police time that will be taken in having to continue to police what is essentially a criminalized approach to possession of cannabis in this country is as wrong after this bill as it is before the bill. So if my colleagues on the Liberal side really believe in the purposes of this bill, that we want to deter illicit activities in relation to cannabis, reduce the burden on the criminal justice system, protect the health of young persons, then why don't we come up with evidence-based provisions in this act and make this act consistent with those purposes? Because this 30-gram limit does not meet that test now.
Thanks very much. Ms. Gladue.
Thank you, Chair. I think we heard a lot of testimony. I was specifically interested in this possession amount because I was concerned that that's between 60 and 90 joints. And we did get testimony from Colorado and Washington that that's the limit that they chose, 30 grams, and the other jurisdictions that have legalized chose that. Now, within the bill, there is provision between 30 and 50 grams for a ticketed offense or some non-criminal intent, which would take you up to 100, 150 joints. And I seriously think, since trafficking is still a criminal offense, you have to really watch where you get from personal possession into an amount that you would be then tempted to traffic to others. So 30 grams certainly is too much, but I accept it based on the evidence we heard.
Mr. Oliver.
Yes, I was just going to, I think as Mr. Davies said, this topic comes up several times, so I thought maybe a number of us will jump in and have the conversation about it now, so that rather than repeating things as each time it comes up. So now might be a good time to have that discussion. So I guess, as Ms. Gladue said, both Colorado and Washington have set, and we've used them, I think, as good models of how to carefully and thoughtfully go forward, particularly in the first phase of introduction of what's quite a significant social change for Canada in the Act. So these are their limits, metrified, if I can say it that way. Theirs are a bit different because they were in ounces, but it is metric. The second thing is it isn't you're over and you get 5 years in jail. These are the secure officers have a choice to ticket and seize, which is very different and doesn't have the same consequence, or they can do a summarily, or they can charge with an indictable offense. So there's a range open, because the goal of the legislation in this phase, I believe, is to stop organized crime and to deter the activity of organized crime. And we heard from many of the witnesses that it was going to be very difficult for us to step in and deter organized crime in this space. So increasing that, having some kind of consequence, I think is important. Recognizing that if somebody's caught with 30 to 50 grams, it can be ticketed. If it's simply somebody caught, as Mr. Davies said, moving across from one province to another for a month's holiday, that would be ticketable at the officer's discretion. I think those are sort of important considerations. And the other piece with organized crime is at some point we do need to, I mean, this is not about opening up recreational marijuana. It's not about choice for consumers. It's not about promoting marijuana. It's about restricting youth to access. It's about deterring organized crime, and it's about safe production. People can have, as Mr. Davies said, unlimited amounts in their home. It's simply if they're caught, if they're in public with it. And I think the issue that stopping organized crime is that people carrying amounts over 30 or over 50 grams, you're starting to, that doesn't look like personal use in public, that looks like trafficking. So I think I don't think it's arbitrary. They've used guidelines from other jurisdictions. I think it's a conservative approach to introducing this particular topic, and those are the points that I wanted to raise in this one.
Okay, thanks very much. Mr. Van Kesteren.
Thank you, Chair. Mr. Davies makes a very valid argument. I must say that his argument is very sound. And I don't agree with that. I would take issue perhaps with a number of things stated. For instance, he says that there isn't a negative effect, but we've heard a witness say that youth right up until 25 there's very clear science that says that there may be very negative effects mentally. So there's just a whole lot of it. When I'm listening to this argument, I'm hearing just confusion. And I'm hearing a legislation that we're getting what we'd like to say, I'm a fisherman, we're getting into the weeds. And when we start to do that, we just start to see how entangled we become. I can't reiterate enough when I say that this is a bad idea. And I really believe that there are many on the Liberal side that know this is a bad idea as well, too. I think as we continue to debate this, and as we continue to go clause by clause, we repeatedly hear about the need to protect our youth, the need to put a stop to organized crime, how shallow an argument that is, and as a matter of fact, how inept it is, and the fact that it has no legs. So although I do agree with we either go into this all out, open the whole thing up, or we really start to look at what this legislation is actually is going to, what it is going to open up, which is Pandora's box. So although I agree with his argument, I disagree with the outcome of that, and so I certainly will be voting against this proposal.
Thank you very much. Mr. Ayoub.
I'll just give you a moment to put your headsets on. Well, basically, we are hedging our bets to an extent. We don't have a polarized view. We're not against criminalisation 100% with no constraints or decriminalisation such as alcohol and tobacco, but we also agree with other arguments that there is a danger for the health of our youth, and that is our top priority, and that is highlighted in the title of this bill. So we do need some framework, some criteria. We want to put an end to the organised crime around marijuana, and we want to ensure that the black market is not 100% eliminated to as great an extent as possible. And then, at that point, we won't need legislation that is as severe. But in the meantime, between doing nothing and keeping the status quo, or on the other hand, opening up the doors wide, I think there's a balance to be struck, and that is what we are trying to achieve and what we're doing here. That is a certain quantity of cannabis so that young people don't clog up the courts by using 5 grams. It's not what we're advocating they consume, but we just want them to be informed and educated, and the same applies for adults. 30 grams is a level of consumption for the average adult, from what I understand, is reasonable, and it's reasonable to possess that quantity, 30 grams, without having a criminal record, etc. Now, aside from that, there's production, trafficking, and that is also one of the goals of the legislation. But we're not going to, in a short space of time, a couple of months, a couple of years, fix this legal issue, because we'll have to come back to the legislation in a couple of years and review it based on the progress that we have made. So I think that we are striking a balance in our stance.
Being no further speakers, you used a lot of time, Mr. Davies, but go ahead for a short comment.
Just one last set of remarks. Mr. Van Kesteren said into the weeds.
Into the
I think we
weeds.
should say into the weed, but he set me up for that. Just a few quick remarks. We are talking about people over 18, so this section does not talk about young people at all. We talked about Colorado and Washington being used as models. Well, we didn't use Colorado and Washington for models in several other very important respects. For instance, they legalized edibles, and this government didn't. So you can't really pick and choose. You can't really refer to other jurisdictions, say we use them as models, but only when it kind of suits your argument. The punishment section of this section is very clearly, the very first part is every person that contravenes subsection 1 is guilty of an indictable offense and is liable up to a term of imprisonment of not more than 5 years less a day. It then has summary conviction possibilities as well. So make no mistake, if you're caught with more than 30 grams, you are liable under this legislation to up to 5 years in jail. You may not get that the first time, I agree, with discretion, but you could. You know, the thing about trafficking, the thing about making the assumption that if the argument is if someone has 40 grams of cannabis, we're going to make the assumption, oh, they must be traffickers. That's actually not consistent with the way the law is now. You can't make an assumption that just because someone has a certain amount of cannabis that they're going to do something. That's why the law currently requires other evidence of trafficking, like scales, baggies, other accoutrements of trafficking. If you've got a trunk full of scotch, nobody assumes that you're going to go sell it on a black market just because you have a lot of scotch. So that I would say leave the law to the discretion of the courts and judges on that. I agree, Mr. Kesteren, I want to be clear. Cannabis is not without health impacts, for sure. But the evidence was very clear that it is not as harmful as alcohol or tobacco. There's no known overdose limit for cannabis, and it's not a carcinogen like tobacco is. So that's why the argument, in my view, is that cannabis should be proportionally regulated as tobacco and alcohol. And we don't have 5-year jail terms from having 50 cartons of cigarettes in your trunk. You can go to the store and you can buy as many cartons of cigarettes as you want. You can buy as much alcohol as you want. So why would we put a limit on cannabis? And finally, the thing is that if Canadians disrespect, if Canadians find that there's arbitrary elements in this law, then they will disrespect the law and they will ignore the law, just as they have been doing for decades. So unless you have a good argument to tell an adult Canadian why they can't have 35 grams as opposed to 25, and one can go to jail for 5 years and one person is a law-abiding citizen, you're running the risk that people will flout the law and disrespect it. And that's really what's happened. So if there's no rational basis to 30 grams, then we shouldn't be restricting adults that way. And if someone's caught with a lot of cannabis, I will wind it up. If someone's caught with a lot of cannabis, Mr. Speaker, if there's other evidence of trafficking, then charge them under that bill. But don't make that assumption simply from the amount of cannabis they have.
All right, thanks very much. Now, so I'm going to call for a vote on NDP 2. All in favor?
Please.
Order to vote. Mr. Clark?
Monsieur Ayoub. Mr. Ayolfson.
No.
Mr. McKinnon.
No.
Mr. Oliver. No. Ms. Sidhu.
No.
Ms. Gladue.
No.
Mr. Van Kesteren. Mr. Weber. Mr. Davies.
Yes.
Yes pour 1, nays contre 8.
All right, that vote is negative.